Okay, so it's a Monday, and I allow myself one anti-American joke per week. So I haven't told one yet, so you get it. Actually, I'm in the Netherlands for the rest of the week, so this is the only audience I can do this. So what's the difference between a British university and an American university? In a British university, the students walk into the lecture theater, the professor's standing at the front. He or she says good morning, and the students say good morning back. In an American university, the students walk into the lecture theater, the professor says good morning, and everybody writes it down. So the gift this morning is that I don't want you to write anything down. Please put down your notebooks. Don't worry about scribbling. We'll share decks. But the point of this is actually to give you 45 minutes and then maybe some questions to reflect on what's going on in the world and how you can translate that into your daily lives to make the world a slightly better place. I will ask you to keep your smartphones nearby, not because I particularly want you to use the app, but if I start to bore you, I'd love you to start checking your corporate email. I'm kind of fascinated by those speakers who are like, can everybody switch off their phones because it's impolite for people to be checking email while somebody's talking. I think the opposite is true. If I am so damn boring that you want to log into your work email, then that's a signal to me that I probably need to move on and crack on with things. Okay. So let's start with what I'm not. I'm not one of those innovation people that say we can change the world, it's all about blue sky thinking, getting in a room with whiteboards, and we can come up with anything and change the world. I do not believe that. I worked in foreign affairs, I was a diplomat, I studied terrorism for a living, what drives people to do the most incredibly destructive things. I actually don't believe that being able to do anything is a gift. I think it's crippling. And by the way, the only people in the world that can do it are these unicorns in Silicon Valley that have more funding than they really deserve, and they get to lose millions, if not billions, on trying stuff out that doesn't make a lot of sense in the first place. For the rest of us, we have constraints. Constraints actually often equal excuses. We can't do this because of that, we can't do this because of the other. But constraints are actually a gift. They are the things that make us outflank problems, to work around them, to work through them, to build partnerships. And so what I'm not is one of those kind of feel-good people who are going to tell you amazing stories about how we can change the world, and you're going to walk out, and then you'll have dinner with a friend tonight and say, do you remember anything that he said? And you're like, no, I don't remember anything that he said. Instead, I'm a negotiator. We study the way that human beings make decisions. We live in your world. How do you get people to take retirement seriously? How do we get people to make choices for the long-term versus short-term satisfaction? What drives people? And I'm going to talk about that lens through which we can innovate in markets, not products, right? How do we change human behavior, which is much more significant to the world than whether we have the latest iPhone? Okay, so we call this a cartography of innovation, because I'm going to give you a little bit of a landscape picture. We're going to make a map of what's going on out there, and hopefully from some of these journeys you can take some things home that are relevant to you, not just in your workplace, actually, but in your personal lives. Okay, first out, I believe that the more we talk of innovation, the less innovative we are. So if you work in an office where there's an innovation committee and there are innovation banners and things saying we can do it, and God forbid your receptionist is renamed to Chief Happiness Officer. They always look so miserable, too. I don't blame them. If I was called a Chief Happiness Officer, I'd be miserable. Then it's likely that you're not very innovative at all. And organizations that are truly disrupting markets, truly doing things differently, don't talk about innovation because they're just doing it. It's kind of called the American way. We just make things better. So let me give you an example of some things that maybe aren't innovation. I was in Japan recently, and I was playing around with this group called Team Lab. They're a group of insane designers. They're not even really a company. They're a cohort of industrial designers and graphic illustrators and coders and algorithm builders. And what I've just done is I've just made a two-dimensional picture of two of my daughters, actually, Coco and Kate. I have three girls, and I drew pictures of the two older ones. And we're about to scan them and bring them to life. That's not quite her. My art is slightly better than that person. So here's Coco. Here she comes. So scanning her, you'll be able to see in a moment that I'm a natural artist. And we're about to bring her to life. So Coco's going to come and interact with all of these other children, and she's going to follow a series of algorithms. Kate's about to follow her younger sister that illustrate how children interact with each other. So they're going to make friends. They're going to bully each other. They're young girls, so they're going to triangulate and be mean girls, because that's what girls do at that age. No, so what they've done is they've built these algorithms around sort of cultural interactions and how people actually interact. And it's fascinating. If you're a parent, you can imagine this. You start to get protective of these kids on this screen. My children were actually 8,000 miles away at the time, but I'm sort of shouting at kids who are being mean to them, etc. Now, the point of this is it's really, really cool. But it's not really innovation yet, because what do we do with this? How do we apply it? Well, it's just cool stuff. And there's a tendency in the press, whether it's Fast Company or Inc. magazine or even Fortune magazine, to just talk about the latest cool stuff. But until it's actually applied to a social problem, it's not really significant. This is what we face right now. We were presented the colors this morning. Those young men and women have been serving in a conflict now that is the longest conflict the United States has ever been involved in. That is barely affecting most of us, yet is deeply affecting those that have to serve. We've got the opioid crisis, we've got gun violence, we've got the aging crisis that you're all working on, we've got the climate crisis. And yet we're talking about whether the iPhone is too big or too small or not. Maybe we need to redirect a little bit of resources. So what's getting in the way? Why aren't we innovating? Well, our first argument is that we're living in bubbles. And so we're driving the same cars, live in the same houses, we go to the same coffee shops, we eat the same processed junk, and watch the same mindless TV. In spite of the fact that we can watch pretty much anything, anytime, we're broadly watching the same crap at roughly the same time of night every night. Now, here's my plea on behalf of England. Please stop watching Downton Abbey, because if you keep watching it, they'll keep making that stuff. And then this one really gets to me. Shopping in the same department stores or the same malls. If you were to go to a mall here in Philadelphia and stand in the middle of it, and then switch off your hearing, put earplugs in, and ask yourself, where in the world am I? Or which city am I in the United States? It would be hard to be able to define which city you're in. Then say, which country am I in? And you're going to struggle. And then ask yourself, which continent am I in? And you realize you could be in Dubai, Hong Kong, Auckland, New Zealand, and the world is increasingly looking the same. So the more we talk about individuality, independence, and freedom, and all of those things, the more bland our lives are becoming. Now, there's no doubt that these guys are getting richer and smarter, but the question is, actually, let's just go back to that. Wow, they're very white, and they're very male. Yeah. So there's no doubt that these guys are getting richer and smarter, and they're incredibly smart people. But the question is, are we? Stand up if you can name this person. Stand up if you can confidently name who this is. Actually, compared to other conferences, that's pretty good. You can take a seat. Thank you. This gentleman's name is Xi Jinping. He's an incredibly powerful leader of the United States' greatest strategic rival. We're in a trade war with them right now, and we're in some significant territorial disputes in the South China Sea. If I'd have asked this question 20 years ago about the leader of Russia, none of you would have had trouble naming Boris Yeltsin. But if I'd have asked you prior to this, did you check Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn to see what some high school friend that you haven't seen in 30 years had for dinner last night? Then you would probably be able to answer that question. And so I don't ask this question to humiliate us. I ask this question so that it resonates in our souls, that while the internet is telling us, or the World Wide Web in particular is telling us that we can have access to anything, we're actually gaining access to less and less. Because these companies are not about providing us information. They do not make money when they provide us diversity. They make money when we look at the same repeating stuff that run ads next to it. They are not a replacement for the London Times or the New York Times or the South China Morning Post. They are not media companies, though worryingly, they're increasingly purchasing media companies. I'm not saying they're bad people. They're not bad people at all. They're just running algorithms. And what they're not doing, they're sitting essentially in the same square mile of San Francisco, or many of their developers are, developing technologies not in coordination. So there are all of these inadvertent effects of what's happening to our society, and there's no grand plan to make sure that we're all working carefully. Let me give you an example of this. Is anybody in here a baseball fan? Raise your hand if you're a baseball fan. Okay. I'm sorry. Terribly boring sport. Anyway, so are we in baseball season right now? Yes. I'm such a horrible immigrant. I'm like such a terrible immigrant. I'm on a baseball playing. Okay, do we have any Red Sox fans in here? Yes, okay, all right. I'm doubly sorry. So I want you to imagine that you're at this conference 10 years ago, and let's say the Red Sox had played last night. And what you would have done, you'd have woken up this morning, and you've gone to the lobby of the building, and try to get a copy of the Boston Globe. You probably couldn't find that. And maybe the Philadelphia Inquirer you might have picked up a copy of, or the New York Times. So you pick up a copy of the New York Times and you read the article about how the Boston Red Sox played the night before. Now, the editor of the sports section of the Times has decided that he or she is going to run an article about Indian cricket that runs alongside the baseball write-up. It's an editorial decision. It's made at the headquarters of the New York Times. Now, you have no interest in Indian cricket. You've never seen a cricket match. You've never been to India. But your peripheral vision as you're reading the sports report about the Boston Red Sox starts to pick up phrases like highest paid sports teams. And your eyes wander, as they do when you're reading print, and you wander over and you read the article and you discover that actually cricket used to be very boring when the English were dominating it. And now the Indians have taken over it. They've made it really cool. They wear college uniforms and they shortened it, and now you can't get a draw after playing for 5 days. And the highest paid sports teams in the world are actually not English soccer players or American football players, but Indian cricket teams. And so you end up reading the article. And you come here this morning, and you mention this to a colleague, and she says, have you been to India? And you say, no, I've never been to India. She said, do you like Indian food? And you say, I've never really eaten Indian food. And she says, there's a great Indian restaurant just down the street. Let's skip lunch today at the conference and go to the Indian restaurant. So you go down the street in Philadelphia, you go to an Indian restaurant, and you meet the owner, and one of the things you discover is there's really no such thing as Indian food. There's all of these regional delicacies, and there's a big rivalry between different regions of India around who has the greatest dish. And, well, the point of this is you go home after the conference, and you're actually interesting. You have something to say. You've learned something. This morning, you woke up, and you went to the NewYorkTimes.com, or you opened the app, and you never saw that article about Indian cricket, because you haven't told the app that you're interested in Indian cricket. But you don't know you're interested in Indian cricket because you weren't given access to it in the first place. But you walk here convinced that you have access to everything, and you do have access to everything, except it's not being piped through the channel, because these algorithms are driven by predicting what we like, and the more we reinforce this predicting what we like, the less and less we see. We're essentially making ourselves dumber, and it's nobody's fault. It's the way the system's running today. We just have to be aware of it and work with it. So we're living these busy lives, but we're living in inspirational deserts. Actually, let's just go over the fight. Imagine you were kidnapped 2 days ago, flown on a plane, and they put you in this room, and they took off the blindfold, and they said, you're in a Marriott. And you say, I can tell from the beige we're in a Marriott. And then they say, which city are we in? All right, okay. So, we're living in these bubbles. The other challenge we have is we have this empathy famine. Empathy, not sympathy. Sympathy is your dog dies, and you've had a pet, and you know how it feels when your dog dies, and you say, I'm sending you my sympathies, I'm sympathetic. If I were you, I would feel that way as well. Empathy is being able to feel like another, regardless of whether you agree with it or not. It is not the question of, how would I feel in their position? It is not, if I were in their role, how would I feel? Which is what a lot of us do when we say we're empathizing. That's not empathy. Empathy is, how would I feel if I were them in their position? And our ability to do this is collapsing, partly tied to the bubbles that we're living in, as is reinforcing the things that we all believe in the moment. Empathy is, how would I feel if I were them in their position? And that's why your great innovative idea doesn't work, because you say, if I was an employee, I would do this. If I were a customer, I would do this. But it's not actually about you. We have to go through these processes where we disenthrall ourselves from ourselves, and we expose ourselves to things that are different, that build our skills in being able to see the perspectives of others, not agree with them. When I was working in the Foreign Service and my colleagues were having to understand the dynamics of Al-Qaeda, they had to be able to empathize with Osama bin Laden and the like. Did I say Obama? Did I just do that? So, not that they agreed with, actually, and for my policy people in the embassy, they also had to empathize with Obama as we were looking at Osama and Obama. Two very different perspectives, but you have to be able to sit in their shoes and see the world as they live, whether or not you agree with it. And that's how you innovate around markets. How are they seeing the world and how does it operate? Innovation is about human feeling, not about how we think. This is why focus groups don't work. When I ask somebody what you think of something, I move to the logical part of my mind and I express a logical thought. What do you think? Would you use this? Does this make sense? Yes, it does. We make choices around feelings. This essentially explains polling error in elections, because polls ask you what you think you're going to vote. And then you get into the polling booth, and you make a decision based upon how you feel. They're just different things. We're asking you a different question. Let me give you an example. This locker is in the Hilton Hotel in McLean. Hilton run an innovation lab there, and they do all kinds of tests around human behavior. And you can go watch this thing. It's an Amazon lockbox, no different from anything else. It's just parked in the lobby of the hotel. And I'm presuming what Hilton want to do with this is to see if they can reduce front desk costs by having guests send things to an Amazon locker instead of having things delivered to the front desk. But if you sit in the lobby, you can do this. It's a public domain environment. And you watch the people interacting with the Amazon locker. Actually, guests don't use it at all. What you see is office workers from nearby coming to pick things up. And what's happening, if you grab people and ask them what they're doing, is that it turns out that guests would much rather have something sent to the hotel. But if you're an office worker nearby and you're doing all of your shopping on work time, you don't like the stuff delivered to your desk. Doesn't look good. So what you do is you have it delivered to the hotel next door. Completely illogical, but it feels right. That's the difference. Which is interesting, because if I was at the hotel, we're not working on this project for Hilton, but if I were at the hotel, what you realize, it's a great food and beverage play, because if you loiter long enough, what you see is people who work nearby who buy lunch or pick up a cup of coffee or something. It's kind of interesting. Now, Hilton are talking about this. Another thing they have in this building is this thing called 5 feet to fitness. So what they've done is they've ripped the couches out of some of their rooms and replaced it with a small gym. And you pay a premium to have a fitness studio in your room. It looks weird, doesn't it? It's just a little bit awkward. I'm going to bed tonight staring at my exercise bike. It doesn't make any sense. And if they focus group this, I'm sure that people would say, no, actually, there's a gym in the hotel. It's 2 stories down. It doesn't make any sense at all to have it in my room. Except for you're traveling on business. You don't want your coworkers to see you in your gym wear. You want to be able to FaceTime with the kids at the same time. It turns out this is incredibly popular. Doesn't make any sense, but it's based upon how we feel. You get the idea. So, this is another one. Let's trash segmentation for a minute. We're doing some pilots for this. This is a cocktail maker. It's an alcohol machine. So think of it as a sort of Keurig for booze, right? It'll make you cocktails. And so we were pilot testing this thing. Actually, it's still going through an investment round, so if you want to invest in it, you're welcome to. So we were placing this thing in different environments and asking people whether they would buy a drink from it. Yeah, it's fascinating, and it really destroys the idea that we can predict what people do based upon how they think. So we'd do a taste test, and we'd have a bourbon that was from the machine, and then a hand-poured, cocktail bourbon poured by some hipster bartender who told stories. And in like-for-like tests, no consumer said that they would prefer the machine-made drink versus a handmade drink, right? So when you did the Pepsi challenge, it didn't win. But it turns out when you put it in an environment, so if we put it in the lobby of the hotel here, and the same business traveler, so let's say it's a 35-year-old female business traveler, and she's traveling with her husband for leisure, they're here to watch a game or something, then without doubt she wants to go to the bar and have a handcrafted cocktail made by the bartender. If she's here on business, then she will actually pay more for the machine so she doesn't have to deal with a bartender and doesn't have to deal with guys at the bar. So it's contextual. But whether she's a gold card holder or whether she's of a certain demographic or an income, all of that segmentation analysis is irrelevant today because everything is based upon context and environment and motive. What is our purpose for the interaction with it? And when you think about motivating your employees or engaging with your customers, having them think differently, you've got to anchor away from the world of logic and anchor into the world of emotional motivation and what drives us there. A great case study of this is Lyft. So if you remember that in the early days, Lyft would have you ride in the front, not in the back. the history of Lyft and Uber is really different. They ended up in the same place for very different reasons. Uber was all about Travis Kalanick couldn't find a cab in San Francisco and wanted a fancy black car service. And the founders of Lyft were all about the design and future of cities. They were driven by different things. But with Lyft, what they did is they asked their friends, would you ever be a taxi driver? And most of their friends said, no, I'd never be a taxi driver. And then they asked a different question. They said, would you give me a ride? And people said, of course I'll give you a ride. He said, would you give a friend of mine a ride? Yeah. Would you give somebody who's in trouble a ride? Yeah. So what they realized is they had to have people sit in the front so it didn't feel like a taxi. You're giving somebody a ride. And then over time, we could migrate it to people sitting in the back. It's not logical, it's how we feel. All right, let's do this. When you're at a traffic intersection and you see this guy, what are you thinking? I'm guessing what you're thinking is, that sucks. It's not logical for me to give him money. I should donate to a homeless organization because that's what I've read, and I do sensible things, and I want to care about solving the heart of this problem. And then what we all do is we get to the office, and we remember this moment, and we log on, and we make a donation to the nearest homeless shelter, right? No, none of us do that. We have that logical thought. Right? OK, now how do you feel at this moment when you're staring at him? You feel terrible, and you feel like you want to do something. But you don't want to encourage a cycle of harm. Now imagine there was a button on your phone that was called the guilt button. And that geolocated the nearest homeless shelter, and you pressed it and $1 went to that nearest homeless shelter, and then you could look him in the eye. You see? Now reverse engineer that into Lyft. Imagine it was part of the Lyft app. And you're traveling in a Lyft and you see that homeless person, and there's the guilt button, and you donate. And suddenly we're making a difference to society in the right ways. It's how feelings work. You just did it. OK. Frame traps. Framing. Framing is a negotiation concept that is, we talk about the things that are in frames. So we put art in frames because we're telling you that it's art. Otherwise, it's just graffiti. We look at things that are in frames. We don't look at things that are outside of frames. I love this quote. John Maynard Keynes is arguably the greatest economist that ever lived during the 20th century. He was a person who, in partnership with other economists, built the current global economic system that we work in. But this line I love. The difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones. Love that line. So let's talk about the world. There's all kinds of things going on around the world right now. We're in trade disputes. We're worried about North Korea. We're worried about what's going to happen in the European Union over Brexit. We're worried about what the Russians are doing. But most of you are worried right now because I got the map upside down. But did I get it upside down? No, I didn't get it upside down. We have a North and South Pole. We live in a three-dimensional universe. Yes, we could choose to put the poles at the top or the bottoms. But there's a reason that we always put North to the top. And the reason we put North to the top is that the Europeans used to put kings and queens on pedestals high up to the top. And the Europeans made the first maps because the Europeans discovered the rest of the world. The rest of the world was there already, but they discovered it. There's two arguments. Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, or Christopher Columbus was lost and some Native Americans helped him find his way. So so we could put the world in any direction. And then there are all of these sort of presumptions that we never challenge. So we never challenge the way that the world goes. We also never challenge time. So time is completely arbitrary. So right now it's 8:47, let's say, in the United States, which if we describe it, it would be GMT minus 5. Actually, it might be GMT minus 4 right now. Time begins in Greenwich. Where is Greenwich? London. It's a borough of London. Why does time begin in London? Because it's the center of the universe. All right. No. Why does time begin in London? Because when we discovered longitude, this will blow your mind, we discovered longitude. So we've already discovered time travel, by the way. For those of you who are skeptical that we'll find the next generation time travel, we already discovered it, transformed sailing. When we discovered longitude, it has to begin somewhere. And time begins in London. It begins in Greenwich in particular, because Greenwich had the tallest hill in London, and it's where Henry VIII, he was the guy who chopped off all the heads of his wives, built a telescope to look at the stars. And it's in London because we had the biggest guns at the time, and we said, this is where time's going to begin. And nobody's ever challenged that. There was a fight at the time, and if you go to Paris and Washington, you can find the remnants of brass lines running through the streets where Paris and Washington, respectively, tried to make time begin there. but it just happened that my ancestors had the biggest guns at the time. Now, imagine we were in a different time zone, so we're in Asia, say, and we're calling back to the United States. Well, we would dial an international access code, and then we'd dial a country code to dial the US. What code would we dial? 1, yeah. Now, when the International Telegraphic Union was coming together to determine the international dialing codes, do you think the rest of the world got together and said, oh, America, you're the best, you get number 1? No. America had the biggest guns at the time and said, thank you very much, we'll be number 1. My point of saying all of this is there are all of these assumptions that we have about the world that operates that are human constructs. They're human constructs. Think about the work that you do. You're having people save and invest money, or you are investing money on their behalf. Money, the concept of money. Those dollar bills that are not backed by gold. Those dollar bills that are promissory notes. They are promises of something. They're not actually something. They're all grounded on the Lydian trade. The Lydians were early Turks in the Mediterranean that were the first to break the bartering system and put coins in its place. You were essentially operating in one of those social constructs. And so your challenge is always to how do we look at the frame in which we're looking at things and make sure that that is relevant to today, that that is important to us today. That's, by the way, why I think the banks and the Fed is particularly freaked out by Bitcoin. Because if you start challenging the concept of the value of a dollar, we start getting into trouble. I agree with them, by the way, but it's all about frames. Okay, so this is how you can take the same data set and see something entirely different depending upon your perspective. So in one case, you can see the United States, or if we change our angle, we see something very different. So remember that empathy thing that I talked about, being able to see other perspectives, whether you agree with it or not? This is why we're not innovating around gun safety. The reason we're not innovating is we're not looking at the same data sets. For half of you, and you're already nervous because I've raised the subject. This is a uniquely American phenomenon, by the way. No, you're all nervous that we're going to talk about guns. We have to talk about guns. We have to talk about the use of guns. But the point is, the reason that we're not innovating around this is that some people see a lethal weapon. And guns can be a lethal weapon. They see this. Other people see America. They see freedom and value. You're going to be at the Constitution Center this evening. You're going to be surrounded by this stuff. Freedom and independence and values. We're not actually solving for the same thing. I'll talk more about this in a minute. But framing might be the most important innovation tool that we have. Because we can either choose about talking about walls, or we can talk about safe legal immigration, around which there is about 99% consensus in the United States that we want safe legal immigration. We can either talk about abortion, or we can talk about reducing unwanted pregnancy. It's interesting, when you move to the latter, you realize the problem and the solution is men, not women. Women can only get pregnant at certain periods of their life, on certain days of that period of their life. Men can create babies pretty much any time. And there's a solution on every intersection corner at CVS and Walgreens. Right? So how you frame the problem can dramatically affect how we innovate to solve it. We talk about gun safety instead of school safety. If we talk about school safety, we might actually be able to innovate around it because we let go some of the baggage of the frame. And we talk about banning tobacco instead of eradicating cancer. We have a huge problem right now around vaping. Is that the FDA, there was a piece on this, they issued a statement just a couple of weeks ago, is that the FDA are convinced that vaping is getting people off smoking, but it's also onboarding teens. And so if we don't stop teens starting vaping, we're actually going to lose this tool to get people off cigarettes. And if you're a smoker, this is a critical tool for us to transform it. But we're stigmatizing one thing instead of focusing on an outcome and being open to how we get there. Isn't it great we get to talk about all these uncomfortable things? Okay. So let's look at how frames affect things. I worked in foreign affairs for a long time. My world was national security. I have a postgraduate degree in security studies from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And it took me years to identify this. I travel on planes all the time. I'm obviously going through TSA check-ins all the time. The TSA is all about what? It's keeping this type of stuff off planes. So we take our shoes off because of the shoe bomber. We go through those body scanners to make sure that we don't have bombs in our pants. We're only allowed 3 ounces of liquid because of the liquid bomb plots between Heathrow and JFK. But then we get on a plane, and for $7, we can buy a knife-sized glass bottle. For those of you who are like me when you were younger, if you were in a bar fight, you weren't lunging for the plastic fork. You were lunging for something like this. We are providing people lethal weapons every day on every aircraft, but we don't identify and we don't do anything about it because we're not thinking like others. We have framed this to be this very linear solution to a problem. Now, let's solve for this. So if I'm on a plane and I ask for a glass of wine, they will give me a glass bottle and a plastic cup, and I pour my wine from the bottle into the cup because that's what we do with wine. Now, if I order one of these, if I order yogurt, or yogurt as you people say, they'll give me the tub, right, and a spoon. But if I'm at home, I spoon the stuff out into a bowl, but they don't give me a bowl on the plane. They just give me the carton, whatever you call those things. So what can we do about wine? How do we make wine safe on planes? We do this. We just put it in a plastic cup. We've saved the airlines 50% of their productivity. We've reduced waste, all of those things. We just have to reframe how we serve wine. And it's great because you upset the French at the same time. More on that later. More on that later. Do we have any French people in the audience? Yes, one. Any more? Raise your hand again. Where's my French person? You're hiding. Can I just say President Macron the other day accused the Brexit leaders of lying, and everybody was appalled by it? Thank you, President Macron. They are lying. All right. OK, shoe boxes. Something as simple as a shoebox. This is how shoes arrive, OK? So how would we reinvent the shoebox? You order a pair of shoes online, it comes in a shoebox, and it comes in another box, and maybe 3 boxes it goes through. Right? This is just unnecessary. We can solve for this. So anybody have a pair of Allbirds? They're these weird shoes that are made out of merino wool. This Kiwi company. This is how their shoebox works. Oh, genius. Look at that. You get it? Just we have a frame of how things are boxed, right? So when we talk about out-of-the-box thing, oh, God, so many cliches. So why does innovation matter now? So it matters now because the social fabric of this country is being ripped apart. Absolutely ripped apart. And it's being ripped apart by dynamics that are way beyond political figures. It's something that's happening within the capitalist system and was defined a couple of centuries ago by these two gentlemen. This is Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Adam Smith, the father of free market economics, who believed that free markets help people and help society, and Karl Marx, the founder of Marxism communism, who believed in extreme form of socialism from those who have to those who need. So they vehemently disagreed about what was right for society. But in their analysis of how capitalism worked, they broadly agree, right? They just disagreed about whether it was good or not. And one of the concepts they agreed on is this idea of the division of labor. And division of labor works like this. It says that under a capitalist system, the owners of the means of production, shareholders, are incentivized to simplify every task possible. And the reason that you simplify tasks is the more simple a task, the more people are qualified to do that job, the greater the supply of employees, the wage rates go down, right? So it's inherent in it. And if, listen to this audience, if you have investments, if you have a mutual fund, then you are an owner of the means of production. You're invested in this system. Simplify tasks, the more people are qualified to do it. And what's happened is, throughout the Industrial Revolution, so first in the mills of northern England, we first saw this. And then we saw in Henry Ford in the invention of the production line, right? We were simplifying, production was going up. Then it got into advanced manufacturing. Now it's in the white-collar classes, where algorithms are more effective at legal discovery than a highly qualified graduate of law school, which is why the law school industry is collapsing. We're seeing this happen, and we are being efficiencied out of relevance. So if we're doing anything that is a linear role, ironically, the more efficient we become at that linear role, the closer we are to a computer or AI being able to do it. But notice it's called artificial intelligence. It's not called artificial emotion. It's AI, not AE. And there are some huge limitations to AI. But our school systems are teaching us to be better and better at very linear things instead of thinking abstractly and using that muscle in our brains that can go around problems rather than through problems. Software is much better than we are now at going through problems. And this is what's happening in society. That middle class is compressing. So we're seeing that bubble at the top. and this compression in the middle. And I think this diagram explains everything that is going on in Western Europe and North America today. So, how do we become nonlinear and become more innovative? First step is to diversify our life. And you can test this by a physical reaction. So when you see a map that's upside down, instead of you leaning back in like, oh crap, the map's upside down, you tilt your head and say, that's interesting. When you hear an opinion that you don't agree with, instead of leaning back in horror or judgment, you tilt your head and say, that's interesting that you think that way, I feel that way, I'd like to know more. That's your physiological test of whether you've built this muscle. This was my day on Saturday. I started at the top right at the farmer's market, surrounded by granola types driving Priuses and Subarus and buying overpriced organic vegetables. I then spent the afternoon at Virginia's Pride Festival. It's the image to the left. And then I spent the evening at an Alison Krauss Bluegrass Festival. That was my day, right, as I went through. There's very little in common amongst those demographics as we went through. I enjoyed every single one of them, actually. But what it did was it was expanding that muscle in my brain around seeing perspectives and issues differently, right? I was just exposing myself to it. It was just interesting. It was fascinating. This is not difficult to do. What it involves is listening to things that we might not have an interest in. So listen to podcasts that you don't necessarily agree with. Listen to talks. TED.com is a raft. I'm sure most of you have heard of it. It's all these 15-minute lectures. But don't listen to things that you think you'd be interested in. Just randomly listen to things. Listen to things about aquaculture or diving or architecture. And just hear perspectives that you're not usually used to and treat it like going to the gym. You're exercising your brain. Whatever your faith, read a holy book of another faith. Not because I'm trying to convert you in any direction, but you're practicing seeing another perspective. You'll actually be staggered by the commonality amongst the holy books. But this is part of your workout. And then, who has a bucket list? Be honest. This is like asking who has a Facebook account every day. I don't have a Facebook account. All right, you all have a bucket list. Here's what I'd love you to do with your bucket list. Over a glass of wine or a cup of tea, whatever is your thing, is go through it and remove anything that's like a thing that is like observing something. Like if you've got see the Eiffel Tower, take that off. Or you've got, I don't know, go to the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, take that off as well. Partly because we're wrecking these places because there are so many people trying to see them. But because it's not really doing anything. So we could fly to Paris, stay in a Marriott hotel that looks a lot like this, walk and speak English all the way to the Eiffel Tower, and check, we've done it, right? Bucket list done. Or we could fly to Paris and stay in an Airbnb and mix with a local owner and choose to wander through a neighborhood where people don't go and make some friendships and hear about what the French think about America, hear what the French think about the future of the world, try some food that we wouldn't ordinarily eat. That's an experience to go off your bucket list. So put some experiences on your bucket list and work through those. And don't worry about whether you're seeing things, because you can see the Eiffel Tower on the internet. It's a big tower. And there aren't any French people there, because there are so many foreigners there. They're like, get out of here. All right. Step 2, detox our senses. So give up coffee for a while. Oh. Wow. Wow. It was easier talking about abortion and gun control than it was talking about giving up coffee. So many insights of this audience. So I spoke last year at it was the National Accounting Organization. It was in Las Vegas. I've never seen more uncomfortable people in a location at once. But the person I felt most sorry for was the Starbucks barista, because at 5 a.m. there were lines of very well-dressed people waiting for a coffee in Las Vegas, and they didn't know what happened. All right, so why you give up coffee? So you give up caffeine, but not necessarily coffee. So you give up caffeine so that you experience what it does to your body. So if anybody's given up caffeine, what you realize is the first couple of days you have acute headaches. A few days after, you're nodding heads. You start to sleep really well. And then when you come back to it, and you have your first espresso, your hand shakes. By the way, I love caffeine. I'm always jacked up. But I try to give it up every now and again. I do. I try to give it up every now and again because I like to see physiologically what it does to our bodies. But you also get some other insights as well, because you realize that you start drinking a lot of decaffeinated tea, and you start drinking a lot of decaffeinated coffee. And what you realize is you're not addicted to caffeine, you're addicted to not work. Give up this stuff for a while. Give up this stuff for a while. And at this season, as we enter fall, give up the thermostat. Open the windows, feel the temperatures. The point is to kind of physiologically have these stimuli so that you see and feel the world differently and get out of these, in this case, air-conditioned bubbles. I recently traveled to Japan, and I flew from Virginia. I changed planes in Seattle, and I flew into Tokyo, and I took the train in Tokyo into the city, and I went through an underground tunnel, and we're in negotiations in this hotel, and I flew back, and I realized that throughout my trip to Japan, I'd never really breathed Japanese air. I'd just been in an air-conditioned bubble the whole period. So try to just break out of this and experience some of that stuff. Step 3 is to unlock our minds, is to just take a break and let our minds do what they are designed to do. This is a citation I received from the city of Richmond recently for driving past a school bus when the stop sign was up. I want to be clear that I wasn't texting, I wasn't reading something on my phone, I wasn't even listening to anything on the radio. I was just so enthralled with myself, I didn't see the bright yellow bus with the flashing lights and the stop sign. And the city of Richmond billed me $250 for that self-enthrallment. And part of this is just this kind of busyness of our minds where there's this hypothesis kicking around at the moment about why people continue to text and drive, even though it's the most dangerous thing in the world. If you think about it, you'd never pull out a novel and start reading as you're driving down the freeway. And this hypothesis is that driving today is one of the few times where we're quiet that we get to face our own souls. And given the choice between facing our own souls and distracting ourselves with a text message, we'll do the latter. I'm not proving it, it's an interesting thought. But it illustrates these challenges that we have around quiet time and how we do it. Many of you will have ideas in the shower, but not ideas in the bathtub. There's a science behind this. The shower creates this white noise, this pitter-patter that's equivalent to silence. You're essentially meditating. You just don't call it that. You're in the shower, you don't have a great deal to do. You don't hear anything but the pitter-patter of the water. In my case, you don't have anything to do whatsoever. You're just standing there, and these ideas come to you. But we have very few times in our lives that are like this. I'll often get asked to coach senior executives. And you can imagine your HR department tells you you're being given a coach. You don't really want a coach. So as a coach, you've got to get control of people. So what I do is I meet them in an art gallery. Wherever is the nearest art gallery. If we're in DC, we'll go to the Kokorin. If we're in LA, we'll go to the Museum of Modern Art. And I'll ask this senior executive to find a piece of art that they love. And we'll find a piece of art that they love, and then we sit down in front of it, and then I ask them for their smartphone. And this look of dread comes over them. I said, it's okay, you can password it and lock it. I just want your smartphone for a while. And then I leave them for 30 minutes, 30 minutes. And I go for a cup of coffee and try to hack their phone. So, and then what's remarkable is when I come back to pick them up, they're in this state of enthusiastic angst, which is like, we're on the wrong strategy, we're launching the wrong products, we're hiring the wrong people, I hate my job, I don't love my husband, whatever it is. But just 30 minutes of quiet time and explosions go on people's heads because we don't have it. We are in this permanent state of distraction and we have to fight for it. Depressingly now, there's a marketplace for this. There's a part of Olympic National Park in the Pacific Northwest called 1 Square Inch of Silence, and it's claimed to be the last square inch of silence in the contiguous 48 states. And now all you can hear is the sound of hikers trying to get there so they can Instagram themselves around. But you get the gist, like find that quiet time. And I'm not talking about sitting in the lotus position. I'm talking about just go for a walk with no purpose. Go ride a bike, stare at art. Just find some time in your life for quiet and see what happens and let those tangential pieces of knowledge and information we have make connections. Now, for those of you who are more practical and come to the practitioners, let's talk about the tools that we use. When we're looking at innovation, when you're trying to change the behavior of your clients, of your customers, think about the journey that you want them to take. And I'm happy to share these visuals with anybody that wants it. So you have your choice path that's the horizontal line running down the center, and a level of engagement and disengagement with your preferred series of choices. In your world, it would be reliably investing in a diverse portfolio that fits their age bracket and will provide for them in retirement. And then you map where they go on and off that preferred line. And everywhere they cross into the disengagement path of where you want them to be, you have an intervention opportunity. Something that you can do that will get them back onto that path. Notice this isn't segmentation and analysis, it's not big data, it's empathy. It's sitting in their shoes of the journey that they're going to take. And the place that you get ideas for what those interventions look like is based upon something called the diffusion of innovation curve. We actually call it the insight curve. And this is for any given product or service, you have a bell curve of intensity of use relative to number of customers. So the top of this bell curve here is average use for any given product or service. If this were a smartphone, the top of that spire would be a 40-something soccer mom who sends 50 text messages a day, surfs the web for an hour, and places 15 phone calls, right? And that's where marketing people go. It's exactly where marketing people should go. But the extremes are really interesting. If we go to an extreme user, what we find is a 15-year-old girl. And if we observe what 15-year-old girls do with their phones, is they do everything except what? Phone. The completely redundant thing in a phone for a 15-year-old is a phone. Right? And so the next generation phone is going to look a lot like a pager. And we'll just remove that. If you go the other side, your ideas, you find elderly in elderly communities who say, I don't need a mobile phone. I have a landline phone, back to framing, because we've told them that it's a landline phone. But actually, it's a mobile phone. It's a cordless phone. Right? So what you need in that environment is a smartphone that has big buttons on it and very little functionality, and put an aerial on it even though it doesn't need an aerial. Right? It'll drive your industrial designers crazy. But you look at the extremes. And for you, don't look at averages. Look at what extreme users of your services are doing and why. What do they get out of it? And what about non-users? And what would it take to get them to be a user and live the journey through their lives? So let's apply some of this to some of the issues that we're dealing with today. Social isolation. Right, a huge problem with men in particular. Suicide rate is going through the roof. The biggest threat facing middle-aged men isn't smoking or obesity, it's loneliness. So we're running this thing at the moment called the League of Extraordinary Ordinary Gentlemen. It's just a bit of an experiment. And men, you're all going to say you don't need this, and then secretly you're going to email me and ask if you can join. Yep. So this is it. This is we work from a house in Richmond. We converted a house, it's like our safe house so negotiations happen. And it had this old shack. And we found this artist to build me a bar. I've basically created an English pub garden in the middle of America. And once a month, we invite men to come and have a drink, whatever they want, and we have somebody talk about something different. So last time, there was a guy who cuts down trees who talked about how you climb a tree. And we've had plastic surgeons talk about plastic surgery and how to start a brewery and just random stuff. And they show up for 2 hours, and then everybody goes. And you can invite anybody that you want. You have to self-categorize as a lonely man, right? So you can be a woman, you just have to choose to be a lonely man for that night. Serious. And this is the venue. It is remarkable what kind of goes on in that place. And now we've got a meeting later this month with an Australian company called Stitch.net, which is interesting. It's doing this stuff for the elderly, which is companionship and community activities and looking if we can scale it. But when we looked at the lives of middle-class men, it involved a lot of being good husbands and good fathers and good employees and very little time actually building social connections and a huge craving for it. But if we survey you lot, you will deny that you need it. You'll deny it. The opioid crisis. My God, if you haven't seen James NAGDCA's pictures on Time magazine, go look at it. It is the most staggering documentary in a way to bring the opioid crisis to life. And I wish we could spend much more time talking about this. But let's stay with this quote. If there was a terrorist that showed up in Montgomery County today and shot 50 people, or 25, or 10 for that matter, this community would be in an uproar. There would be an army here trying to stop it. That's exactly where we are with opioids, but who's showing up to stop it? And so one of the things that we're doing right now is we're looking at how do we put naloxone next to these things? How do we take opioid safety as seriously as we take fire safety? If you're an employee, you're going to get opioid training of how you identify and how you help and how you recover somebody as much as putting out that fire or helping somebody having a heart attack as it goes through. And you can do this as long as you live through the lives. And again, focus groups isn't telling us anything. But if you're experiencing the opioid crisis in any way, please email me because we want to map your journey very closely. This is huge. Let's come on to your world, the aging crisis. Right? It's like global warming. It's happening so slowly that nobody's talking about it, right? You've got your own icebergs melting. So you do the same thing. So we can present data like this, and we can present it to the American audience or a European audience, and nobody takes it seriously. What we have to do is we have to tell narratives of what it's like to be a caregiver. So you're that 40-something professional, and you're looking after kids and your aging parents at the same time. What does that customer journey look like? What does that narrative look like? And then how do we build interventions for it? We've got a research site at the moment. If you're interested, it's called 9minutes.org. It's all based upon this idea that when you're a parent, you get 9 months to prepare. And when you become a caregiver, you get maybe 9 minutes, right? Mom's been diagnosed with dementia. Dad had a fall, whatever it happens to be. And all the resources that are out there that can push away morbidity much closer to mortality, to put it in economist speak, and the raft of things that you can do. But you can follow this journey, and we've mapped out all of these journey maps of what caregivers' lives look like, and then the services and the things that they need to support them. But just the narratives themselves lead people to save more for their own retirement and their own care, because when they experience it, they'll respond to it. By the way, their core craving, when you get them in private, is, I want a life. Sure that resonates. I'm going to finish with French men. We're going to solve for French men. But before we do that, I want to open this up to questions. So I think you have apps. Let's see if anybody's asked a question. I want to try and unlock this thing. So the team here are so fantastic. They said, you're going to mess this up, but we'll forgive you. OK. There are no questions to moderate right now. So if anybody wants to ask a question, they can do, and we're going to loiter at the end if anybody has any questions. But first of all, we're going to solve French men. OK. There is a dynamic in French society that is French men peeing in the street. So what happens is they go to cafes, and they drink too much, and they stagger home, and they pee against the wall. That's why in France you see a lot of people hosing the streets instead of sweeping the streets on a morning. Okay? So this is called a urinoir. It works like this. It's obviously gone through Google Translate, because I don't know what civilized wild peeing is, but I want to do it. I absolutely want to do it. So the only thing I want you to remember from this morning is not about the opioid crisis or the aging crisis or how innovation works or any of that stuff. It's that we can solve for problems if we think differently. This is how this works. The Frenchman pees into this thing. It goes into a bale of straw. Instead of hosing down the streets, the municipal workers take the bales of straw and they go compost them, and it comes back on the plants on the other side. It's not pretty, but a lot of what we do in life is not pretty. We are destroying this planet right now consciously without a plan B. Let's hope we find alien life forms before they find us, because if they analyze us, they're going to see us as a destructive virus and take us out before they even talk to us. So in an environment where we're making these insane choices, things that you're grappling with every day, then we have to start approaching this differently, to say, not what should people be doing, but how do we guide them down pathways that follow the right behavior? And the way you're going to think about this is a bale of straw in a urinal in Paris. That's it. Thank you very much. I'll add this. Sorry, one final comment. In terms of your responsibility, I'll put up a picture of Susanna in a second. In terms of your responsibility around this, Winston Churchill's back in vogue at the moment. He's another great example of framing, because you either see him as this sort of imperial bastard or this savior of the free world. It depends on your context of what you're experiencing and what your nationality was. But he's back in vogue right now. He had this wonderful line in one of his biographies. So he started his career very successfully and ended his career very successfully. He was very old when he was prime minister. But he had this long period in midlife where he was very unsuccessful. He called it his wilderness years. And one of the things that he talked about, as he suffered depression, actually. He would lay bricks as his solution to depression. They didn't call it depression back then. He called it his black dog. But he said that he carried around this burden of greatness. It's an interesting phrase, this burden of greatness. He just knew that he had to be great. And I don't think any of us deserve to carry a burden of greatness. But once you know these techniques and once you know that they work, I think you carry a burden of responsibility to do something and not observe the world. There is nobody out there that is doing this. It's up to us to do it. And it's all about small, incremental changes to make the world a somewhat better place. So if I've touched on any of these issues that you have experience of or an opportunity of, I'm about to put up my email address and contact details. Please reach out to us. Susanna is in the audience. Susanna's my producer. She's around too. So if we don't get to speak to you today, just drop us a note. And if you want to make a difference to any of these things, please let us know. That's it. Thank you.